I'm graduating in half a year and I've got a job lined up, so we don't need her anymore, right?
We don't. But she's still of use until we inherit. So I'd like to get rid of the trash as soon as possible.
It seems John was also there. Since we had separate bedrooms, I only realized John was awake at this moment. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop on their conversation, but their unsettling talk froze me in place. They continued their heart-wrenching conversation without knowing I was listening. For the next 6 months, I pretended not to hear their talks and didn't change my demeanor. And then came Robert's college graduation day. He left early in the morning, bustling with excitement and getting ready. Of course, there was no word of thanks for raising him or an invitation to a meal directed towards me. "Just so you know, I don't need dinner today," was all he said before he left. Had I not heard the conversation, I might not have minded, but I couldn't help but think a simple word to me wouldn't have been amiss. He's probably going out to eat with his biological mom and John. John mentioned he wouldn't need dinner either. As the two of them left, I was alone in the quiet room, with just paper and pen in hand. I am Mary, currently 55 years old. I've been living with my husband John and his son, Robert, for 20 years. John and I are both remarried. I was mentally broken from not getting along with my ex-husband's family and was discarded like trash by his parents. John reached out to me during these tough times. He was an old high school classmate of mine. We weren't close in high school, but after attending a small reunion for close friends, John, learning I was divorced, reached out and we exchanged contact information. At the time, John was raising his 2-year-old son, Robert. He is a single father.
Our lives aren't over yet. Let's do our best,
he said, which greatly comforted me. It didn't take long for us to understand each other's emotional wounds, and soon we were attracted to each other. Though scared of marrying again, I was persuaded by John's approach and decided to date him. Then, at 35, I remarried. After the marriage, I quit my job to become a full-time homemaker. Despite being advised against quitting my job and remarrying, Robert was only 2 years old. I thought it was most important to spend time together and be recognized as a family. Since Robert was too young to remember anything, and I always loved children, I wanted to dedicate myself to raising him. I thought there would be no problem with remarrying someone with a child. However, I soon realized my thinking was naive. Robert wouldn't eat or sleep, and he would start crying just by seeing my face, showing extreme stranger anxiety. Hoping his stranger anxiety would subside as he got used to me, I tried hard to become Robert's mother. I endured his night crying and played with him with all my might during the day, but he wouldn't open up to me. Seeing me troubled, John said,
"Your mom was a real beauty. You know, maybe he just can't get used to Mary's face."
It was a thoughtless comment, without any ill intention. Yet, at that moment, I felt deeply hurt as a woman, a wife, and a mother. And John kept doing that, comparing me to his ex-wife at every turn.
"What brew are you using? The beef stew my ex made was tastier."
An unnecessary comment every time he had the beef stew.
"My ex was awful at parenting. You could at least try to beat her at that."
a comment that seemed to put down his ex but was actually mocking me. Before we got married, he was always encouraging, with an attitude of us tackling challenges together. After marriage, there were times I felt treated like nothing more than a servant. No matter what I did, Robert never warmed up to me, and John's words and actions were harsh. Thoughts of divorce crossed my mind more than once during our first year of marriage. But leaving would just have everyone saying I told you so. Rome wasn't built in a day, I told myself, pushing through with household chores and child-rearing. Ultimately, Robert never did warm up to me. He stopped crying at the sight of me, but he never smiled at me or called me Mom. He was friendly with John's family, and even strangers, but it seemed like he just didn't like me for some reason. Despite that, I gradually began to feel affection for Robert. I was happy to see him grow.
Mom, please don't come.
When he started preschool, he grudgingly began to call me Mom. But attending preschool events, Robert would practically chase me away with a look of sheer terror. Consulting his teachers, they said he was just being clingy, but no solutions were found. While his growth brought me joy, the rejection from Robert continued to trouble me.
It'll get better eventually.
John would say that but never really faced my concerns. One day, I asked Robert, Mommy loves you very much. What can I do to make you love me? Robert looked surprised by my question. I felt uneasy at his expression but waited patiently for his words. Then Robert opened his mouth.
Mom, do you really love me?
Of course I do.
No, you're lying. You hate me. Dad said so.
I was shocked by his words. John had said that. What was he talking about? What do you mean? Dad said I hate you.
Yeah, I'm not fooled. You're a fake mom. It's your fault my real mom is gone.
After leaving those words behind, Robert stormed out of the living room. I was devastated. I had nothing to do with the divorce between Robert's mom and John. Yet, John blamed everything on me. Even though Robert was young, his refusal to open up to me, calling me a fake mom, was all John's doing. That night, I confronted John. Robert called me a fake mom. I can't imagine he would know to say that unless you told him, right? Who else would tell Robert such a thing? But John just brazenly denied any wrongdoing.
I did say it. But it's not wrong, is it? Don't blame me because he's not attached to you.
I was so frustrated, I couldn't say anything back. I still didn't understand why John would do something like that. In the end, my relationship with Robert didn't improve, and I felt increasingly distant from John as well. But children's growth doesn't wait for anyone. It was when we were preparing for Robert's elementary school entry.
This backpack is good, right?
John pointed to a high-end backpack. I was shocked by the price. It looks nice, but isn't it a bit too expensive?
Why don't you ask your parents to buy it as a gift?
Huh. I couldn't immediately grasp what John was saying, tilting my head in confusion.
Your family is wealthy, and they could afford a gift for their grandson's school entry, right?
John said this as if it was the most natural thing, not noticing my bewildered expression. Indeed, my family was financially comfortable. They owned real estate, and my grandfather had even been listed among the wealthiest individuals. Given that John and I went to the same high school, it wouldn't be surprising if he knew about my family's financial situation before we got married. Hearing about grandparents buying backpacks for school entry is common. However, Robert and I have no blood relation. And, since he hadn't warmed up to me, I never took him to visit my family. For New Year's greetings, John would say, "You and Robert don't need to go. We're not blood related to your parents. If you want to visit them, go by yourself," using the lack of blood relation as a reason to avoid interacting with my parents. Yet, he had the audacity to suggest they buy an expensive backpack as a gift. From my parents' perspective, they have no particular attachment to Robert. It might be a bit difficult, I said with a wry smile, declining John's suggestion. However, John seemed irritated.
Why not? Just ask them. If they say no, then I'll know where we stand.
His condescending tone irritated me. What do you mean by where we stand? I wanted to retort but held back. Of course, I couldn't impose such a burden on my parents. I planned to buy the backpack with money I had saved up from before I was married, and pretend it was a gift from them. Surprisingly, my parents offered to buy the backpack.
In our hometown, it's common for the maternal grandparents to present such a gift. If Robert's birth mom's family or John's family were planning to give one, I thought it might be presumptuous of me to offer, but isn't Robert's mother Mary?
Her words warmed my heart. Someone recognized me as Robert's mother. In times when I felt like breaking, my mom was always on my side. Thank you. It doesn't have to be too expensive. Something that Robert would find easy to use would make me happy. I thanked my mom, my voice choked with emotion. Soon after, a brand new, plain black backpack arrived. Robert's eyes sparkled when he saw it, and he immediately tried it on, looking pleased. However, John frowned upon seeing Robert's reaction.
What's this? It's too ordinary.
But this was recommended by the store as being popular. It's light and durable, which is perfect since Robert is small and heavy items aren't suitable for him.
I don't care about it being light. It lacks luxury.
John continued to criticize the backpack we received as a gift. Robert, who had been happy, quietly put the backpack down after hearing John's words. He then lost all interest in it. The same thing happened when it was time for middle school entry. John insisted on high-end brand sports bags and shoes for school, expecting my parents to buy them as gifts. As Robert entered middle school, he began to mock me on his own, influenced by John's behavior.
It's good you married Dad since your family is rich.
He said that, mocking me. I'm sure John must have been saying things like that to Robert. I had been pretending not to notice, but by this time, I was acutely aware. John had married me because my family had money, and to secure someone to take care of Robert. Stop saying silly things and go study. By this time, I had given up on being liked by Robert. Even if I was called fake, I believed it was my duty to raise him as his mother. If I divorced and left, it would just be Robert and John living together. I think Robert will have a very hard time. I might not have been a mother that made him happy, but my feelings of affection for Robert were genuine. That's why I wanted to spare him any hardships. Robert then graduated from high school and went on to college. That's when John started saying we should ask my parents to help with the expense of college fees.
Let them pay for their grandson's education. The money will eventually be Mary's anyway. It's better to use it on Robert now.
But of course, I couldn't ask my parents for such a large sum. Backpacks and sports bags were one thing, but this was entirely different. However, I knew I would get snide remarks from John if my parents didn't contribute. I used the alimony I received from my previous divorce to pay for his tuition. Although I had something else I truly wanted to use it for, I pretended it was from my parents and allocated it towards his tuition. Because of this, Robert was able to attend college for 4 years. He even received a job offer and was nearing graduation. Though we couldn't build a good parent-child relationship, I felt my role was coming to an end as he had grown up without trouble. It was on one such day. I woke up in the middle of the night and got up to go to the bathroom. I noticed the light in the kitchen. Thinking Robert had come home from a night out, I went to the kitchen to find John there too.
I'm graduating in half a year and got a job offer, so we don't need her anymore, right?
Useless. But let's keep her around at least until we inherit. I want to get rid of the trash as soon as possible.
It seemed John was also awake. Since we slept in separate bedrooms, this was the first time I realized that John was awake. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but their unsettling conversation rooted me to this spot.
Trash, ha ha ha.
Robert echoed, laughing.
Yay, let's go out for a meal as a family after the graduation ceremony. I'll treat you with my part-time job money.
I was momentarily uplifted by his words. But then I was devastated again.
Actually, I've invited Mom to the graduation. She used to come to school events when I was in elementary school, but I haven't invited her recently. I thought it would be nice for the last time.
That's great. It's been a while since we've been able to get together with just the family. I'm looking forward to it.
It was a casual conversation about inviting his birth mother to a meal. While there's nothing wrong with that, and I didn't expect anything in return for raising him. I had been rejected from attending any school events or milestones since kindergarten. I had wanted to attend his college graduation, but was told, no parents attend college graduations. Yet, he had been inviting his birth mother since elementary school. She hadn't contributed to his upbringing or education, just having given birth to him seemed too much of a good deal. John must have facilitated the contact without any consideration for me. Even though I tried to accept it, Robert's words, implying his birth mother was more important than me, directly hurt me.
Well, I'm not saying I'm not thankful to Mary, but she's not family. When we were divorced, I wondered how I was going to raise you, but having a convenient housekeeper around was a lifesaver.
Well, the cleaning and laundry were fine, but I wish the meals were better. The lunchbox was inedible. I always had a hard time figuring out who to pawn them off on.
You got to eat whatever you liked with that money. So it worked out well for you, didn't it?
Following that conversation, John and Robert's laughter echoed. Hearing this, I stood there in shock. It was an even more shocking fact. It was terrible that despite making lunch every day since he was in middle school, he was selling it to others. It was disrespectful to the people he sold them to and essentially trampled over my feelings, thinking I was doing something nice for Robert. Struggling to move my frozen legs, I quietly moved away from there. Listening to their mocking laughter any longer felt like it would break my heart. I had been married for 20 years, raising Robert since he was 2 years old. Yet, I was never once acknowledged as family. I crawled into bed and cried. Then, I decided on something I had kept close to my heart for a long time. For the next 6 months, I acted as if I heard nothing and changed nothing about my behavior. Then came the day of the university graduation. Robert left early in the morning, bustling with excitement and getting ready. Of course, there was no word of thanks for raising him or an invitation to a meal directed towards me. Robert left with just the words, "I won't need dinner tonight." Had I not overheard that conversation, I might not have cared, but a part of me wished for at least a word directed at me. Probably he was going to dine with his biological mother and John. John also said he didn't need dinner. After seeing them off, I sat alone in the quiet room with paper and pen. It was just past 1 p.m., too early for them to return home, when my phone rang as I was having lunch outside. The call was from John. I glanced at it and sipped my coffee with a smile. I had no intention of answering the call immediately and let it ring for a while. I bet he's panicking on the other end. Feeling a bit sorry for the incessant ringing, I finally picked up. Yes.
Mary, is that you? Where are you? What's this note about?
As expected, John was in a panic. Seeing the note meant he had returned home. If I told you where I am, it wouldn't really be running away, would it? Everything is written in the note. When I said that, John stumbled over his words, but. As the conversation was going nowhere, I sighed deeply. That's how it is, so please submit the divorce papers I've filled out. At those words, John seemed to snap back to attention. I had left the divorce papers along with the note.
I won't accept a divorce. But what do you mean the tuition fee is unpaid?
At that, I smiled again. Apparently, to John, the unpaid tuition was more concerning than the divorce. Oh, aren't you supposed to be at work? How do you know about that?
Oh.
John was at a loss for words, stammering. It seemed that John had attended the university graduation ceremony with Robert's biological mother, his ex-wife. That's probably where he found out about the unpaid tuition fees.
Anyway, they told me that if the unpaid amount isn't transferred by the end of this month, he won't be able to graduate. Just tell your parents to transfer it right away?
Why should I, just a mere housekeeper, go to such lengths? My tone inadvertently grew sharper. But it was my honest feeling. I'm just a housekeeper, right? You've brainwashed Robert since he was little not to get attached to me.
That's not true. He was attached to you, and he actually called you Mom, didn't he?
Don't lie. He only called me Mom because you were concerned about appearances, right? John fell silent. I paid the tuition for 3.5 years anyway. If you want him to graduate, why don't you, as his parent, pay at least for the last semester? I left him with those words and hung up. A few days after overhearing John and Robert mocking me one night, the bill for tuition arrived. Given all the demeaning things said to me, being called just a goal for money, and a housekeeper, I couldn't bring myself to pay. The university contacted me several times. According to the university's rules, if the tuition remains unpaid, even if Robert could attend the ceremony as a prospective graduate, he would be expelled if payment wasn't made by graduation day. In other words, he had to transfer about $6,000 by today. After hanging up with John, Robert also called.
Hey, you witch. What's this about unpaid tuition? Why haven't you paid?
It seemed he wasn't with John. Otherwise, he wouldn't dare speak to me like this. Ask your father for details. I have no intention of involving myself with you two anymore.
What? What does that mean?
Take care, then.
Just wait a minute.
I cut off his protests, ending the call. Since the day I overheard that conversation, I had decided to leave the two of them behind. I then disappeared from their lives completely. My phone kept ringing all day. If they had time for this, they might as well make the transfer. The next day, I changed my phone and number. 3 months later, while at the municipal office for errands, I discovered the divorce papers hadn't been submitted. Feeling frustrated that nothing had been done in 3 months, I reluctantly returned home. Since the key still worked, I entered the house to be greeted by a strange smell. What's this smell? Like rotten food. Entering the living room, the source was clear. The source was littered lunchbox trash, instant noodle cups, and washed dishes piled in the sink, socks whose removal date was unknown, and a mountain of laundry, uncertain if ever cleaned. In just 3 months, the house had deteriorated into a garbage dump. But as expected, it was indeed as expected. It was the home of 2 men who never did any housework. It couldn't possibly be clean. Yet, I had hoped for a bit more tidiness.
Mary, you came back.
Hearing my name, I shivered. Turning around, a scruffy John stood there. You didn't go to work. He hesitated before responding.
I got fired.
Fired.
I got caught taking money from the company's safe to pay for Robert's tuition.
His confession left me astounded. You embezzled for just $6,000.
It's not embezzlement. That's an exaggeration. I got fired, but the company said it's okay if I return the money. And since Robert won't need tuition anymore, just come back home instead of being stubborn.
Are you stupid? I yelled at him loudly. I knew you were foolish, but I didn't realize to what extent. I've already left a note saying I've cut ties with both of you. But now that it's come to this, I can't live without you. It's all because you or your parents didn't pay the tuition, right? Faced with John's defiance, I let out another heavy sigh.
Please, come back. I love you.
He pleaded, nearly in tears. Those words you never said during our marriage mean nothing now. You've always been dependent on others. Why don't you try to sort things out yourself for once? I replied, half laughing. A dirty room and a dirty man. I heard a rustling sound, and when I looked over, a cockroach emerged from an empty cup noodle container. This house will only have cockroaches for family if it continues like this, I said, laughing. John didn't reply, just hung his head in defeat. Afterward, the divorce papers were successfully submitted. 3 years later, in a new place where I had finally found happiness, I received news of a death. The news was that my mother had passed away. At the funeral, 2 familiar figures approached me. I slowly lifted my face.
It's been a while. You look healthier than I thought.
It was John and Robert. John and I have many mutual acquaintances. They must have heard about my mother's passing through the grapevine. And despite all that she had done for him over the years, Robert never once thanked her. Thinking they had come to pay their last respects made me slightly happy, so I asked, "You came?"
Of course, you're an only child, right? So you'll inherit everything, and eventually, as your son, I should inherit too, right? I need to thank Grandma.
What? I couldn't help but frown. I felt a surge of disgust at the outrageous things Robert was saying. What are you talking about? You have no right to inherit anything.
But he's still our son, even if we're divorced.
John added with a smirk. Angered by their motives for attending, I raised my voice. Leave, if that's your attitude. I'd rather you didn't come to pay your respects at all. My voice was louder than I intended, attracting attention from those around us. John and Robert, as usual, were unfazed by my raised voice. However, at that moment, someone arrived who could turn the tide.
What's all the commotion about?
What happened?
Approaching were a man and a woman. And, upon seeing them, John and Robert went pale. The ex-husband and his son. I introduced John and Robert to the 2 people. Then Thomas and Emily frowned. John spoke up nervously.
President, why are you here?
President, you know Thomas. I asked John, but he didn't reply. Without waiting for his response, I continued. This is my husband Thomas and our daughter Emily.
Ed?
John and Robert looked up, surprised, and looked at me.
My wife has been under your care. You're Thomas from the HR department, right?
Yes.
What do you mean? John works for Thomas's company. I asked Thomas, and he nodded. John looked away, as if realizing he had made a mistake.
I don't intend to mix personal issues with business, but I won't forgive you if you hurt Mary any further.
I didn't mean to.
John stammered. Robert, too, said nothing, shrinking down. Emily then spoke up.
I heard something about inheritance, but Robert, you have no inheritance rights.
Her tone was as if she knew Robert well.
So, you're the stepson my mom talked about.
Emily laughed. It was hard to imagine the once arrogant Robert looking so diminished. When I looked at Emily curiously, she explained.
I'm her biological daughter. Why would you, a stepson, think you have any inheritance rights?
Biological daughter?
Yes. I'm not a stepchild but her true, blood-related daughter. Did you really think you were the only child and special?
Robert turned red. Robert likely never imagined that I had a biological child. In fact, Thomas was my first husband. We had Emily, but Thomas's parents didn't like me, and I was forced to give her up. You should forget you have a child, my in-laws would say. I wasn't allowed to be involved in Emily's upbringing. Thomas always defended me, but his family has been running a business for generations. He couldn't go against his family, especially his father. Eventually, I fell ill and reluctantly agreed to divorce. Later, I heard Thomas raised Emily well despite his parents bad-mouthing me. Thanks to Thomas, Emily grew into a kind-hearted girl who would send me thoughtful letters once a year. While married to John, I had no direct contact with Thomas and Emily. Yet, Thomas would sometimes bring Emily to meet my parents because she was their granddaughter. I always heard about Emily from my mother. I was curious about Emily but never dared to meet her while married. The love I tried to give to Robert was unreciprocated, and I ended up raising him out of sheer willpower rather than affection. After divorcing John, Thomas reached out. My mother had told him about my divorce. Even after our divorce, Thomas hadn't remarried and seemed to have kept me in his thoughts. Now, with his in-laws gone and his career stable, Thomas proposed we remarry. I shared this development with John and Robert. So, Emily is a child of mine and Thomas.
What?
John turned pale. He likely never imagined that the woman he had employed as a housekeeper was someone's beloved.
Did you approach me because I'm the president's daughter?
Emily sharply asked Robert.
It's not like that.
But ultimately, you married my mom for my grandmother's money, right? I can date someone like that.
Robert wiped away secret tears, devastated by Emily's words. It seems he said to Emily that he loved her without knowing where they had met. If Robert had been raised differently, not brainwashed by John, the relationship between my born and raised children could have been a source of happiness. Unfortunately, Robert had grown too similar to John. Being with someone like Robert would indeed be troublesome. I couldn't help but agree. My parenting was at fault. I'm sorry, Emily. You deserve someone better. Robert, please stay away from Emily and her money. After being rejected in front of everyone, Robert glared at me, but he couldn't say anything back. He's also a victim of John, but as an adult. He won't find happiness unless he acknowledges his and his father's faults.
That's why you should leave too. This isn't a place for those who aren't family.
Thomas said, effectively kicking them out. It was the perfect retort, echoing the "you're not family" I had once heard, back at John and Robert. John reportedly continues to work at Thomas's company, feeling out of place. Given his age and the reason for his previous job termination, finding another job would be unlikely. Why did you hire him, knowing about John? When I asked, Thomas laughed.
Of course, I knew. Keeping him under me ensures he won't bother Mary.
His words warmed my heart. I hadn't realized it was all for me. Moreover, there was surprising news.
It seems like the son has cut ties with him. He's probably reflecting on his past actions and attitude towards you.
Remarkably, Robert had moved out to live on his own. Rejected by Emily, his plan for a large inheritance failed. He realized happiness requires personal effort. While I felt serves you right towards John, I didn't wish for Robert's unhappiness. I hope he grows through his struggles and finds happiness, a testament to my role as his mother. I now live with Thomas and Emily. After driving me away, my in-laws regretted their actions, seeing the depressed Thomas and Emily. But it was too late to change anything after I remarried.
Did you think you were happy?
Thomas asked. There were happy times sometimes. I smiled too. But the happiest times of my life are yet to come. Emily is soon to be married. I hope to live long enough to turn our past struggles into laughable memories, aiming to grow further.